maybe 4, I can't remember. Congress passed the Medicare prescription drug bill, by and large written by the drug companies, as you know, in those days. And one of the things that bill didn't do, many of us pushed for it unsuccessfully, and the bill passed. It was one of those middle-of-the-night votes that passed after arms were twisted. After 2 hours, the rolls were left open and all that. And the legislation said that it prohibited, not just didn't speak to, actually prohibited the government from negotiating with the drug companies to bring down the price of prescription drugs. So there was not only a specific dollar subsidy to the drug companies, there was a mechanism for the government to push drug prices even higher for beneficiaries. When you see how we've done that in the Canadian government, this isn't their single-payer system, this part of the Canadian plan. The Canadian government negotiates on behalf of 30 million Canadian citizens with every drug company that's selling drugs in Canada and brings the price down. The Veterans Administration, as you've mentioned before, Chuck, the Veterans Administration does the same in this country, and the VA pays, I haven't seen the numbers in the last couple of years, but pays, okay, I was going to say roughly half of what is paid by Medicare beneficiaries for drugs. So those two things clearly are in the president's focus on this health care bill. As we write this bill, and my committee, the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, that Chairman Kennedy chairs, and the Senator Baucus Committee, the Finance Committee, and in the House, the Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce Committees, as we write this bill, there will be a lot of attention paid to those two issues.
I don't want you to take this personally, so I want to first say that given that there is a U.S. Senate, I'm very glad that you're there. But the Senate seems to be increasingly functioning on a basis that is designed to enhance the individual power and the individual perks of individual members at the expense of governance and of the ability of the institution to function. I've looked at my copy of the Constitution, and I can't find the 60-vote rule in there anywhere. There were checks and balances built into our Constitution by the framers, including some relating to the Senate, but that was not one of them, as far as I can tell. The Senate's facing a big test on the matters that you discussed in the next few weeks, and probably other matters as well. Is the institution up to the job? Are we going to have majority rule in the U.S. Senate?
I think we are. I think that we're going to pass health care this year. I think that climate change is more difficult, but possible. We've done some important, smaller issues already with credit card reform, with some significant housing legislation, with Lilly Ledbetter, with S-CHIP that affects an awful lot of people in this community. So I am more optimistic. Now, I also understand the frustration that we all face. I mean, I think that the fact Al Franken hasn't been seated yet tells you a lot about how important the 60 vote level is. And it used to be, I mean, this is progress. It used to be 67 votes. But one quick story about that. In the 1950s, when Congress simply couldn't pass a civil rights bill because of my party coupled with Northern Republicans, but the Southern Democrats even more so. In those days, there was a reporter from the New York Times that said that as Richard Russell and Strom Thurmond and others were filibustering and blocking civil rights legislation hadn't passed the Senate in 75 years, literally, or 65, whatever, for decades by the 1950s. And this reporter wrote that the South is that the United States Senate is the South's unending revenge for Gettysburg. And it really the Senate is a dysfunctional body in some ways, clearly, because the majority doesn't rule, because it's slow and lethargic. It was described by George Washington, and it was partly built that way. I mean, James Madison said that I am very much paraphrasing what he said in, I believe, Article 10 of the Federalist Papers. Madison said that the Senate is there to protect wealth. And it does a pretty good job of that, in my view, far too often, and why this country hasn't moved forward on some things that we should move forward on, particularly health care. But I do think that the Senate also is, George Washington described the House and the Senate as the House is the hot water boiling over the teacup, cooled by the saucer of the Senate. to cool sort of public passions. The House is every 2 years, the Senate's every 6 years. The House, it writes its rules. The House starts every session with no rules. The Senate operates under the same rules it's operated under for 150 years, literally, and it can only be changed with, in this case, 67 votes. So to eliminate the 60-vote filibuster requirement, if this isn't a catch-22, you got to get 67 votes to change that requirement. So it ain't happening soon. But there are ways around it, and there are ways that, I am confident, and I say this in a room of people, including journalists who are going to hold me to this, some perhaps more than others, I really do think we're going to pass. I want to tell one other story. I apologize that I'm filibustering your question. Ralph at the beginning talked about back in 1992, I made this promise way before Connie and I were married, before we knew each other, that I would pay my own health insurance until Congress passed coverage for all of my constituents, thinking that Congress would do that in 1993 with President Bill Clinton. Well, they didn't, and they still haven't. So 15 years, I still pay my own health insurance. I'm now on Connie's plan in the last 5 years, but I pay a lot of money. I do pay a lot of money in. I'm not complaining in any way for that plan. But so Connie and I were talking in the 06 campaign. This just really hadn't come up, and we thought, okay, I lived up to my promise. I only made it in 92. I didn't make it every 2 years, but I lived up to it for the whole 14 years in the House. And we were just thinking, do we just not make this promise again, and then I go on the government health plan? Because, so I would think so we're preparing for a debate one day in a hotel room, I think in Dayton. In Toledo, okay, Toledo. The journalist's eye for detail. So we're there, and we had not, there was something, I want to do too much inside baseball here, but there's something in political campaigns now that the political party late in the last 2 months of the campaign can't spend money directly in large amounts to help a candidate coordinating with that campaign, but they can run something called independent expenditures. And Senator DeWine and I both, our political parties, each spent more than $10 million, around $10 million, his maybe 12, mine 9.5, something like that, $1 million to help our campaigns, but not coordinated. They couldn't talk to us about what they were doing. They could only watch our campaign. They had a different set of consultants. We didn't know who they were, all of that, and then do their TV ads. And also, we were kind of wondering, where was John Glenn? Because John Glenn's a pretty good friend. He wasn't doing anything in our campaign at that point. So we're watching this. We're sitting in the room. All of a sudden, John Glenn comes on, endorsing me, that paid for by the independent expenditure. We're pretty excited. It's like, this is really nice, because John Glenn's endorsement matters. And then John Glenn, in the middle of the ad, says, and Sherrod Brown promised he wouldn't pay. He'd pay his own health care. And he is going to, if he's done it for 15 years, he's going to keep doing it. So, Madam Editor, I didn't make that promise, but it was made by others. But anyway, so. Is it over? Where's it? Okay.
In light of the fact that the insurance industry and the Swift Boat Group are out trying to prevent there being any legislation that includes a public health plan, what do you think the chances are that that will be included in the final package that passes?
I think they're good. I think they're good. The Democratic caucus go on it right then, and people are hesitant to sign on to things that they're, for all kinds of reasons, sometimes strategy, sometimes to maintain flexibility in their own movement within the legislative body. Some don't like to co-sponsor bills much. So that's not a majority of the Senate, but it's a majority already. It's half already, and it's a strong majority of people on the Democratic side. It also includes Harry Reid. It also includes all the Democratic leadership. It also includes the President of the United States. And why I think we're going to, the public plan option, is again an option with not a mandate, but an option. Why I think it stays is, I think it's clearly very defensible. I mean, the argument is sound, and the argument is pretty overwhelming to most of the public. But the other reason is is what I hear more informally out of the White House. About every 2 weeks, there's a little Chinese restaurant that in my little kind of hole-in-the-wall restaurant near my little apartment in Southeast Washington, on Capitol Hill, that about every 2 weeks I go with the senior White House official to dinner there, for two reasons. One, to get to know them better. Second, to remind them that, Ohio helped elect this president, and Ohio, they do a whole lot more in Ohio. Every year,